Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. And in this next segment, we are going to hear from the UN Security Council. And in this case, we're talking about Syria and the ongoing process or the hindrance of the political process for Syria to reform government, help with humanitarian aids, and some of the suppression that's going on, especially against women and girls. And it is ongoing process for the UN to deliver humanitarian aid. Their efforts are halting and coming to a standstill in what is actually happening with the Syrian government. There's a lot of potential for things to happen, but it's slow moving at best, stalled in many cases. And if we listen to what is being said in a report by the representative of Norway to the UN Security Council, you will hear what some of the issues are and how they are going to be, or how the United Nations is attempting to deal with these holdbacks. So let's listen to what was actually said in the Security Council.
Speak also on behalf of Ireland as co-pen holder on the humanitarian file. In our statement, we will in particular put focus on the fact that 2.4 million children in Syria is out of school by the start of this school year. And we know that without schools, the risk for especially for girls with early marriages, and of course for the young and young adults being recruited to armed groups. So we are very concerned about also the situation for schools and education in Syria. Another thing that affects very much the humanitarian situation is the recent outbreak of cholera in Syria, which proves again the very strong necessity for humanitarian assistance into Syria, being it cross-border and cross-line.
And with the UNGA High-Level Week next week, what are you expecting to be addressed? Are there any topics you're worried might get a little lost while all the world leaders are here, because everyone's going to be focused on Ukraine?
Yeah, there is a good reason for the world being focused on Ukraine, the war, and of course the implication of the war globally for food security and increased food and energy prices. But I'm sure, as always, that we will also be able to put focus on other crisis situation. At least we will do our part, being it Afghanistan, being it Syria, Middle East peace process, and other topics.
Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you. Should we wait for Security Council statement on Armenia and Azerbaijan?
That's too early to say. Thank you.
Ah voilà, elle arrive. La 9000.
The 9,130th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Syrian Arab Republic and Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Ms. Najat Roshdi, Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and Mr. Mazen Darwish, General Director of the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda, and I now give the floor to Ms. Roshdi.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Ambassador Nicolas de Rivière, it's a true honor for me to be able to address the Council today as a Deputy Special Envoy for Syria.
Envoy briefed you 2 weeks ago on his latest engagement to move the political process forward. Since then, he has engaged Arab, European, Iranian, Russian, Turkish, and U.S. representatives in Geneva and appreciates their support. He also engaged with the Syrian Negotiations Committee in Geneva and look forward to visiting Damascus as soon as possible to engage the government of Syria. He remains focused on addressing substantive challenges that have faced the Constitutional Committee and to see it reconvene at the earliest in Geneva. In parallel, he continues his consultations to advance a wider confidence-building step-for-step process. Today, let me take a step back and touch on immediate concerns that cause so much suffering for so many Syrians and tell you what we are doing to ensure these issues are front and center of any political process. First, civilian safety and security and a consolidated ceasefire. Second, the humanitarian suffering of the Syrian people and its exacerbation by the country's economic collapse. Third, the tens of thousands of arbitrarily detained, abducted, forcibly disappeared, and missing persons. And fourth, the specific ways in which the conflict impacts women and girls and our efforts to ensure the meaningful participation of Syrian women equally and together with men in its resolution. Monsieur le Président, 2 weeks ago, the Special Envoy called for restraints in the face of a troubling escalation of violent incidents. But Syrian civilians are still being killed, maimed, detained, displaced, and unable to return home in safety. Their infrastructure and livelihoods are still being destroyed. Even in the past 2 weeks of relative calm, we have seen not only ongoing exchanges of rocket and artillery fire and other security incidents, but also continued reports of sporadic air and drone strikes in different areas of northern Syria, as well as reports of Israeli airstrikes, including some that temporarily took Aleppo airport out of service. And of course, there have also been violent incidents by listed terrorist groups, including fresh violence in Al-Hol. It remains clear that the political process will not advance meaningfully or sustainably until violence is curtailed and ultimately ends. Resolution 2254 itself recognizes the close link between a ceasefire and a parallel political process. Of course, we take note of the ongoing effort by different international stakeholders to preserve different ceasefire arrangements which have contributed to freezing front lines for over 2 years. and we are fully aware of the myriad challenges in de-escalating violence further than that, and in dealing with the presence of listed terrorist groups in a manner that complies with obligations to protect civilians. But a nationwide ceasefire remains a fundamental goal of the political process, something which we continue to underline to ceasefire task force participants in Geneva. And we strongly underline, too, the obligation of all parties to strictly adhere to international humanitarian and human rights law. Monsieur le Président, I commend the work of humanitarian colleagues who continue to work to meet the needs of Syrian civilians. And those needs skyrocket as access remains constrained and threatened and as resources dwindle. We are supporting them very practically through the humanitarian task force in Geneva. We need to use all tools available to us to ensure the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2642 through all modalities, whether cross-borders or cross-line, with increased support for life-saving aid and early recovery. But we must look not only at how to meet the humanitarian needs of Syrians, but how to stem the sources of their needs. De-escalating violence will take us a long way in that regard. So would addressing the factors driving displacement or fear of return, which must be safe, dignified, and voluntary. Addressing all these factors is part of creating a safe, calm, and neutral environment in which a political process can unfold. Action is also needed to deal with Syria's economic collapse, a major source of needs. Stabilizing the conflict and advancing a sustainable political solution are the best ways to stem this economic collapse. But meanwhile, Syrians are struggling with essentials, food on the table, fuel for warmth, basic services, and livelihoods. The economic crisis is complex, goes without saying, and a decade of conflict, coupled with the impact of mismanagement, sanctions, and more recently, the de facto division of the country, the Lebanese financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the reverberations from the Ukraine war have all contributed to leaving the Syrian economy in such dire straits. To stem this economic collapse, we therefore need step-for-step confidence-building measures within the political process across a range of issues, just as we continue our humanitarian work. Monsieur le Président, every month we stress the priority of addressing the issues of the detained, abducted and missing persons. The relatives of those whose fates and whereabouts are unknown, mothers, wives and daughters in particular, bear the brunt of supporting families financially, physically and emotionally, while also leading an unfathomable search for their loved ones. This search put them at high risk of exploitation, harassment, violence, and stigma, on top of extortion to secure ransom or bribes in times of incredible economic hardship. And they are often in the impossible situation of having to declare a loved one missing because this is the only way to support their families in terms of, for instance, right to inheritance, custody, or property. We are greatly concerned at report that we continued practice of arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearance, abductions and kidnapping for ransom, including of women and children, continues. The families of the missing have, however, recently achieved a milestone. They have worked hand in hand in the past years alongside civil society organizations, as well as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, our office, and other organizations. And their voice is now reflected in the recent report of the Secretary General calling for your support for a new international body for addressing these issues in a humanitarian and holistic manner that is victim, survivor, and family-centric, grounded in the right to know, and as the only way to start for the families the healing process. Monsieur le Président, Syrian women are suffering from detention, torture, and abduction themselves, as well as their family members. And they are definitely not the only ones who need our help. Syrian women in general have carried a special burden throughout the conflict. Many are managing and sustaining households and holding communities together in the absence of men. And yet, just as they need livelihood, many women find themselves unable to secure jobs or advancement given the conflict and its impact on the economy. The Special Envoy and I, like my predecessor, attach great importance to hearing the voices of Syrian women in the political process. Syrian women can and must play an active role in shaping a political solution and in ensuring that it translates into reality on the ground. 2 weeks ago, I consulted extensively with the Syrian Women's Advisory Board in Geneva, as did the Special Envoy. We had a series of discussions that brought home the realities of conflict, which they framed as increasingly compounded by factors beyond the control of Syrians. They underscored the effect of the economic crisis, the dangers of a youth exodus hollowing out society, the economy and state institutions, and the predation that Syria's adults and children face, including refugee and IDP communities, such as sexual abuse and forced labor at the expense of an education as humanitarian needs grow and humanitarian budgets are stretched to their limits. They reminded me that Syrian children are growing up without their health, education, and standard of living assured, and with gaping uncertainty to their futures. And they are developing an ambitious work plan, and we will continue to facilitate their meetings and amplify their diverse voices. Meanwhile, the Civil Society Support Room's 2 new thematic working groups will convene in Geneva very soon to support the political process. These dialogues are part of the facilitation and engagement of our office with a broad range of Syrians, allowing us to keep close contact with those who see the situation on the ground, allowing inside Syrians' evolving views, and providing us with advice on creative openings for the political process. Above all, the women who meet in the Women Advisory Board and the participants in the wider civil society dialogues demonstrates to all of us that despite many differences among them, common ground can be found. This is the most important insight I have gathered so far in this job, that progress is possible, and that Syrians can come together to rescue their country and focus on its future, that they are committed and willing to engage, and that their fight is one of a peaceful future for Syria. We must advance a sustainable, inclusive political solution to keep the hope for those who are fighting every day and correct Syria's trajectory on all these fronts. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Rushdie for her statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Griffiths.
Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much indeed. Since my deputy, the Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator Joyce Masuya, briefed you 2 weeks ago, hostilities in Syria have continued. During this period, airstrikes and shelling along front lines have caused civilian death, injury, and interrupted livelihoods. Particularly devastating, if I may draw your attention, on the 12th of September, 3 children were reportedly killed and 4 people injured when an IED attached to a motorcycle detonated close to a medical facility in a camp near Al-Hasaka city. One more tragic story in the 10-year war. I'm particularly concerned also over news of a cholera outbreak in northern Syria. The UN and partners are supporting relevant authorities to respond to the cases. And this outbreak, the cholera outbreak, is a stark reminder of how critical our continued support remains to the people of Syria, given that the health system is devastated by those 10 years of conflict. This outbreak is also an indicator of severe shortages of water throughout Syria, resulting from the low water levels in the Euphrates we have frequently discussed in this Council, drought-like conditions, and the extent of destruction of water infrastructures. In the northeast, amid the cholera outbreak, critical water shortages are reported in Al-Hasaka Governorate as water remains inaccessible for the population through Aluk the water station we also discussed since the 11th of August. It's shut down. In this context, access to safe water is more important than ever. And of course, I call on all relevant parties to facilitate reliable access to safe water. Otherwise, we will see more of those cases of cholera. We will see more damage to the health system. We will see more problems arising out of the absence of reliable electricity. Monsieur le Président, today I'll cover three important issues: recovery, early recovery efforts, funding, and access, humanitarian access. I regularly brief this Council, as you know, on our work to strengthen the resilience of affected communities. The focus on this issue responds to the realities of a changing context and allows us to focus our collective efforts on driving down the need for humanitarian assistance in Syria. And Najat has referred to the economic basis, the cause of many of our humanitarian problems. Resilience and early recovery are a major priority, as I think I've said quite often in this Council. With the support of donors and in line with the global humanitarian approach to early recovery, over 4 million Syrians have benefited from projects that contribute to early recovery and resilience already this year. We also continue to contribute to the provision of electricity, which is essential, as I have mentioned, to run basic services. And the bi-monthly report of the Secretary General provides many examples. For our programme to succeed in improving people's access to livelihood opportunities and basic services, we need the continuing commitment and support from donors and their continuing generosity and their focus, as is the case for so many, including my neighbour, on early recovery opportunities. Mr. President, this brings me to my second point, which is focused on funding. The Humanitarian Response Plan for Syria, the annual plan for humanitarian assistance for Syria, is among the largest appeals in the world. In 2022, $4.4 billion is needed. It's a lot of money. In addition, the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, which caters for refugee needs in the region outside Syria, amounts to $6.1 billion for this year, bringing the total up to $10.5 billion, a quite eye-watering amount of money. But the amount reflects the severity of humanitarian needs in Syria and in the region following this decade of crisis. And at the 6th Brussels conference in May 2022, where many of us went, including the permanent representative of the United States, donors pledged $4.3 billion for Syria and the region. To date, only a quarter of the humanitarian response plan is funded. This is very low, even in a difficult year globally, as compared to other major crises. And the regional plan that I referred to, the $6.1 billion, only has 20% funding. So about a quarter for us and less than that for the regional plan. Engagement with regional donors, donors in the region, indicates that we may not even reach half of the funding requirements for the humanitarian response plan by the end of the year. And that obviously has a direct impact on the plight of many Syrians. 14.6 million people in Syria, more than half of them children, need humanitarian assistance. This is the highest level of need since the crisis began. And as I think I've said on previous occasions, we seem to fail the people of Syria more each year, as each year comes, and as each year passes. The needs grow, the gap increases, and the stress and the suffering of the Syrian people from this crisis continues to be exacerbated. I want to thank donors who come through quickly on their pledges and urge those, perhaps slightly slower, to please put the money in the bank. Funding for early recovery and resilience programming and livelihood programming also, I hope, will be increased. And you know, the consequence of this, and we see it elsewhere, Yemen and elsewhere, is that rations will be drastically reduced if we don't get funding. It's as I said just now, it's a straight line. Then, Mr. President, on humanitarian access. Airstrikes since the last briefing disrupted operations of the UN Humanitarian Air Service. UNHAS at Aleppo airport. UNHAS is a critical service for the humanitarian operation, and it is the basis upon which staff are deployed, staff move, and occasionally also supplies. Our ability to provide humanitarian assistance in Al-Hol camp was limited during this period of reporting, particularly by the search operation carried out from the 25th of August. Only life-saving assistance, such as bread and water distributions, were and are currently allowed. And ensuring continuity in the provision of aid and basic services and protection during those kind of operations is of critical importance, and it has not been the case. We would like to see all humanitarian activities resumed as soon as possible. The UN continues to do its utmost to expand cross-line operations in all parts of Syria. In the northwest, we have finalized a revised cross-line plan incrementally to ensure further access to people in need of assistance. For this to happen, we need to carry out many unimpeded cross-line convoys with an increased number of trucks in each convoy. This is common sense. The next cross-line convoy to the northwest is scheduled to take place in the coming days with 16 trucks in that convoy, and we expect more to follow, and we want more to follow, and we need more to follow, and you can be sure, Mr. President, the United Nations and its partners will make every effort to ensure that the cross-line operations in the northwest and the northeast are pursued with vigor. And they are necessary, and if successful, will complement the cross-border operation, which is, of course, of a different order of scale. In the northeast, we and our partners continue to assist on average 900,000 people every month through cross-line operations, and we will continue to pursue that elusive cross-line mission to Ras Al Ain as soon as security conditions allow. I want to conclude, Mr. President, with an anecdote that has been brought to my attention, a story of Rasha, a mother of four, and this also echoes a point made by Najat. A mother of four, a community leader in Idlib. She lives in a displacement camp with 1,200 other families, many of whom have special needs, disabilities, and war injuries. Rasha herself had her spine badly damaged in 2019 when she was nearly buried alive under rubble during a bombing, together with her husband and children, until local responders, the White Helmets and others, pulled them out. She is now permanently in a wheelchair. And yet despite that, and with financial support from donors and sponsors, she was instrumental in setting up a kindergarten and a physical therapy center in the camp where she lives. This center provides services to about 20 surrounding camps. And just imagine, if you will, the energy and determination of this mother, crippled by the war, still providing a daily service to 20 camps around and near the one where she continues to live with her family. And she sees about 50 patients every day. This is the kind of light that we need to remember is pursued by the people of Syria. The centre now needs additional support, and we will all see what we can do to make that happen. And in that context, we asked her whether she remained optimistic, and this is the echo of Najat's point. And she said, "Nothing is impossible when there is will and action." Will and action, I would add, which she shows on a daily basis. Will and action, Mr. President, which naturally we need to see also from the members of this Council. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Darwish.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to address your Council. As the voice of ordinary Syrians, as you know, the local powers that are sharing the Syrian geography do not have any political or moral legitimacy. However, to be fair, they are trying their best to represent the international and regional powers that created them. And in spite of the foregoing, I would like to suggest all the players in Syria to withdraw their ambassadors and to stop using my country as a battlefield to set scores and to start a strategic real partnership with the Syrian people, especially that member states, the United Nations, and in the preamble of every single resolution, they stress the importance of respecting the sovereignty and independence of Syria, as well as the territorial integrity thereof. And even the Russian Federation is always coupling the humanitarian aid to the respect of sovereignty. And allow me to remind you that this word sovereignty is part and parcel of all your constitutions. And even the charter of this organization starts with "we, the people of the word." Then why would Syrians be the exception? Why would be the Syrian people deprived of their sovereignty? Why would be let any of the member states to the Security Council to be in charge of Syria? Because unless Syria gets its democracy and sovereignty, we wouldn't be able to stop all the problems that are emanating from Syria, including mercenaries. Mr. Problem. I don't know if it will be useful to you to repeat the numbers of civilian victims, because we have heard enough, and no doubt that you regularly take note of all the reviews and all the reports of the United Nations, and no doubt that you have had access to any of the leaked pictures or maybe even some clips, video clips of the solidarity carnage. I'm sure that you are all fully aware of the humanitarian catastrophe in Syria, and unfortunately this catastrophe is still chasing those whom we thought they had escaped Syria. And we do highly appreciate the efforts of hosting countries, especially neighboring countries, because it's no more possible to stay silent or to pay compliments to those who are practicing racism and intolerance against Syrians. Every single day, the politicians of hosting countries, in the announcement and declaration of their intentions and plans, are stressing the point of the return of Syrians, especially the safe return of Syrians. However, this is arbitrary and forced return that is very perilous. And I sincerely want to return to my country, but without legal guarantees and without application of international law, my return will be only giving the executioners a second chance to kill me. That's why, after failing to protect Syrians in Syria, I would like you to protect them according to the international law and to protect those refugees that have escaped human rights violations. Mr. President, notwithstanding this oblique picture in Syria, this is the first time for me to address your council, and I do have some hope as the continuous efforts of victims and their families led to highlighting the issue of refugees and arbitrary disappeared. That's why I do appreciate the study and the report that was issued by the Secretary General recently on the situation of the MIST in Syria, and which calls for creating an independent international mechanism to clarify the fate of the MIST in Syria. Maybe this is the first time that you would have a real road map to start to look into one of the most pressing and urgent humanitarian issues in Syria. Accordingly, I do appeal to all countries to adopt the recommendation of the Secretary General and to start right away on the implementation thereof. Actually, there is nothing to discuss anymore, and we will not accept the delay of this plan. Mr. President, the majority of Syrians are dreaming of the day when peaceful settlement materializes. On the basis of the Security Council Resolution 2254 and the Geneva Communique. But for any settlement to be sustainable should be based on transitional justice. Thus, it might be useful to remind you of the Mexican-French initiative as well as the code of conduct that was suggested by Switzerland and which called to foregoing the veto right in relation to any atrocities. And in conclusion, I would like to stress and to remind you of the Dayton peace process in Yugoslavia and of Milosevic, who, notwithstanding the fact that he was a killer, he was, at the end of the day, tried before the ICC. Please remember in every single step that you take to advance peace in Syria that the only virtue in war is the end of the war. However, any political agreement that does not include justice will not lead, except maybe in the best case scenario, to ceasefire. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank Mr. Darwish for his statement. I now give the floor to those Security Council members, by starting with Norway.
Thank you, President. I deliver this statement on behalf of the co-pen holders for the Syria Humanitarian File, Ireland and Norway. Let me first thank the briefers for their presentations. As we have heard so many times, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains alarming. Conflict, food insecurity, drought, COVID, and a collapsing economy all contribute to a heavy toll on the Syrian people, one that they have been carrying for too long. 90% of people in Syria live in poverty. We are concerned particularly about the gendered impact of the conflict, including an increased risk of early marriages of girls and for boys, and the risk of recruitment to armed groups. This underlines the need for a holistic and broader humanitarian response, one which is sufficiently funded to deliver life-saving aid and protects against violence and abuse, such as sexual and gender-based violence. It also underlines the need for early recovery, including electricity to support access to essential services. President, with the school year now starting, it is particularly worrying that across Syria, some 2.4 million children are out of school. As UNICEF have reported, 1 in 3 schools in Syria are no longer used for educational purposes. Some have been destroyed and damaged. Some function as shelters for displaced families, and others are being used for military purposes. We reiterate this Council's expression of deep concern about attacks and threat of attacks against schools. We urge all parties to refrain from action that impede safe access to education. This includes refraining from the military use of schools and other educational institutions. The right to education and the continuation of education, including for displaced children, must be safeguarded. President, in June this year, OHCHR released a report estimating that 306,000 civilians have been killed since the conflict erupted in 2010. We deplore the recent escalation of hostilities. Civilians must be protected. Equally concerning are the estimated high number of those who have disappeared over the years of conflict, including humanitarian workers. Progress in identifying and recovering missing persons is important, and appropriate humanitarian actors must be given unhindered access to all places of detention. President, the recent outbreak of cholera in Syria is also of serious concern, and further underlines the importance of ensuring safe, rapid and unhindered access for delivery of medical items and other life-saving aid to the people in humanitarian need all over Syria. As pen holders, we have consistently been supportive of all modalities for the delivery of humanitarian aid, both cross-border and cross-line. This is not a question of either or. The UN and its humanitarian partners must be allowed to use both modalities to deliver protection and assistance in accordance with humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality and independence. We want to see further progress on cross-line humanitarian deliveries, and we encourage all involved actors to facilitate this. But it is also crystal clear that the humanitarian cross-border mechanism is the essential lifeline to many millions in need in Northwest. With the winter coming, we as a council must take the responsibility to ensure that this lifeline continues. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me thank Deputy Special Envoy Rockde and Undersecretary General Griffiths for your briefings. I also deeply appreciate the briefing from Mazen Darwish. Mazen, your advocacy to promote freedom of expression and dialogue in Syria is admirable and an important reminder for all of us. The Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression hosts the distinction of being the first Syrian NGO to ever be granted UN accreditation. We are also grateful for the work you continue to do. As our briefers have outlined, the Syrian people remain in peril. The Assad regime and others have made little progress in addressing the political situation as envisioned in Resolution 2254. And it's painful to hear about the further deteriorating humanitarian situation on the ground. The new cholera outbreak just reported by Undersecretary General Martin and recently also reported by UN resident and humanitarian coordinator Riza poses a grave threat to Syria's people. This is yet another crisis facing the Syrian people who have had to endure over 11 years of conflict that has killed more than 350,000 people, conflict that has displaced 13 million people, and conflict that has pushed over 2 million people into severe food insecurity. The United States has been a committed supporter of the Syrian people, and that is why we have pushed so hard over the past year for a one-year renewal and expansion of the Syrian cross-border mechanism to address this and other crises faced by the Syrian people, and that's why we must extend the mechanism in January for another 12 months. In May, at the Brussels conference, I announced over $800 million in additional U.S. humanitarian aid for the Syrian response. And today, I'm proud to make a new additional funding announcement of more than $756 million in humanitarian assistance for the Syrian people. This new assistance will bring immediate relief to millions of refugees and displaced persons. It will help humanitarian partners provide clean water, food, hygiene, and relief supplies, shelter, protection services, and critical health and nutrition assistance. And it will include support for early recovery programs across the entire country. And in case it is not clear, let me say it directly. This funding shows just how urgent and dire we believe the situation is and how committed we are to the full implementation of Resolution 2642. This assistance will touch the lives of Syrians in all 14 governorates. It responds directly to the UN's humanitarian response plan, in which early recovery accounts for over 1/4 of its activities. We remain the world's largest donor to Syria because we are committed. As I said in San Francisco last week, we're committed to serving the people of the world. We have not and will not forget about the people of Syria. The U.S. commitment to the Syrian people and full implementation of 2642 is beyond question, but we cannot do this work alone. The needs in Syria are simply too great, so we call on other countries to join us in doing more and giving more. Even as we work to galvanize more international assistance, we know that only a durable political solution to this conflict will allow the Syrian people to rebuild and recover. A just, enduring peace is the only answer. This Council has clearly outlined a pathway to such a peace in Resolution 2254. Unfortunately, the Assad regime, aided by Russia, has consistently stalled and subverted these processes, sowing more instability and violence. The unfounded and unnecessary delays in the Constitutional Committee's work must end. And while Russia has repeatedly told this Council that the political process in Syria must be Syrian-owned and Syrian-led, it continues to obstruct the process of the Constitutional Committee for reasons entirely unrelated to Syria. These delays have a human cost. Instability and violence have robbed Syrian refugees of the dream of returning home. We commend the member states that continue to host large numbers of Syrian refugees, and while many refugees hold out hope that they will return to Syria, no one should pressure them to risk their lives to do so. After all, more than 130,000 people are still arbitrarily detained and are missing inside Syria. The vast majority of these detentions are enforced disappearances, have been at the hands of the Assad regime. And as the Secretary General's recent report on this issue spells out, the Assad regime has made little progress in addressing detentions and disappearances. This is not a welcoming environment. Until all those missing or arbitrarily detained are accounted for, we will not and we cannot be silent. Internally displaced persons and refugees will not return home as long as they fear for their own safety and that of their loved ones. Colleagues, it is beyond frustrating to have the same meeting month after month and not see progress toward a long-term peace. It is past time for the Assad regime in Russia to meet their commitments. It's past time for them to take responsibility for the violence and instability. It is past time to do right by the Syrian people. In the meantime, I commit that we will keep up the pressure. We will push for progress, and we will continue to do everything in our power, as we've done today with this new $756 million funding announcement to support the dire needs of the Syrian people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci à Madame Rushdie.
Thank you, President. Thank you to Ms. Rushdie, Mr. Griffiths and Mr. Darwish for the update on the situation in Syria.
The situation in Syria has not improved since our last meeting. It remains a dark festival of the horrible, of the unacceptable. I will try not to repeat things we have said before many times during our repeated meetings, and I will limit my remarks to a few key points. First, the situation on the ground. Ongoing hostilities, including airstrikes and shelling across the country, continue with their usual lot of casualties, displacement of civilians, destruction of civilian infrastructure. Conflict remains intense in frontline areas and other pockets across the country, with an enduring risk of major escalation. Needless to say that hostilities and, in general, a continued multidimensional crisis exacerbate an already terrible humanitarian situation. My second point, as we heard again from USG Griffiths. Humanitarian aid needs to reach everyone, everywhere, and what we just heard from the US delegation should bring relief to those in need in Syria. We support the implementation of all aspects of the cross-border resolution 2642 over the coming months, as well as an early recovery initiatives and humanitarian access through all modalities, including cross-line deliveries, and remain convinced of the crucial need of this mechanism as the only lifeline for millions in Northeast, and we call for its renewal for at least 12 months next January. Third, the political track. We wish there were more news than keeping record of the successive meetings when they happen or allowed to happen by the regime sponsors of the Syrian-led Constitutional Committee and the UN auspices in Geneva. We strongly support the efforts of the Special Envoy and his step-for-step approach, but he cannot walk alone. The lack of trust undermines his genuine efforts and others. Without will and true efforts, the current deadlock will continue, prolonging the agony of a country in dire need for hope. We welcome the involvement of civil society in this process. Fourth, these 11 long years of war marred by the worst of atrocities, grave and outspread human rights violations have inflicted untold pain on Syria's civilians. Syria is today one of the countries that has the highest number of detainees and missing persons. We have repeatedly called in this chamber for the creation of an independent mechanism with a strong international mandate to clarify the fate and whereabouts of missing people. We commend the Secretary General's study on how to bolster efforts, including through existing measures and mechanisms, to clarify the fate and whereabouts of missing people in Syria and provide support to their families. It should be a key priority. Deliver concrete results in order to bring relief to families and build trust and confidence among the Syrians, as we heard from Mr. Darwish, rightfully so. Fifth, the overall security situation in Al-Hol camp remains dire, with reports of increased number of sexual violence. Also, the situation for women and children in the quote-unquote widow camps in northwest Syria remains largely under the radar. Women and children are under threat of violence, with no means to earn a living and with no access to basic services. Children are particularly at risk, and many are involved in child labor in the camps. We wonder what kind of adults children raised in such horrible conditions will become. Finally, Mr. President, I wish to highlight the issue of impunity for serious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. Accountability for serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law is crucial to achieving sustainable peace in accordance with Resolution 2254. No just and sustainable future can be built sitting on the top of a mountain of crimes committed in Syria. Syrians need a future, one that they can build themselves, but in freedom and with justice. And I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3, namely Gabon, Ghana, and Kenya. We thank the Deputy Special Envoy for Syria, Ms. Najat Rochdi, and USG Martin Griffiths for their briefings and updates on the political and humanitarian situation in Syria. We have also taken note of the remarks of Mr. Darwish and welcome the representatives of Syria, Iran, and Turkey at this meeting. Mr. President, it is regrettable that there has been no meaningful positive change on the situation in Syria, notwithstanding this Council's monthly meetings. It is still marked by political instability and violence, which have created an ever-worsening humanitarian crisis of an unprecedented proportion. Our intervention this morning will focus on the political, security, and humanitarian aspects of the matter. Mr. President, there is no military solution to the inordinately protracted crisis in Syria. We reiterate that the most viable avenue for sustainable peace and stability is a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process that meets the aspirations of the Syrian people, undertaken with the support of the international community, particularly the facilitative role of the United Nations. Today, we implore the parties and stakeholders to inject a new lease of life into the fragile political process, including through the following three elements. First, a return to the 9th session of the Syrian-owned, UN-facilitated small body of the Constitutional Committee meetings. The parties need to agree on the modalities for the resumption of the talks as soon as possible to help lay a foundation for the resumption of the much-awaited political process. They must demonstrate political will and commitment through constructive engagements that will lead to tangible outcomes. Secondly, engaging in confidence-building measures. This would include addressing the situation of detainees, including facilitating the release of detained vulnerable groups such as the elderly, as well as women and children, and clarifying the status of missing persons would be a significant confidence-building measure. The proposals outlined by the Secretary General in his report on this issue will be a good starting point. Progress in this area will also contribute positively to the Special Envoy's step-for-step approach in accordance with international humanitarian law. Thirdly, the enhanced role of regional stakeholders and the international community in support of the political process. This should be in line with Resolution 2254, which remains the foremost roadmap to achieving the desired political solution in a manner that takes into account the interests of the wider spectrum of the Syrian population, including women and civil society. In this regard, the recent statements of commitments by the like-minded envoys on Syria on August 31st, as well as the Special Envoy's recent international engagements as part of his quest to find a lasting solution to the Syrian conflict are encouraging. On the security situation, Mr. President, the A3 is alarmed by the continued indiscriminate airstrikes, mutual shelling, and rocket attacks, as well as the use of explosive devices on the front lines. The victims of this unrelenting violence are largely civilians, including women and children, as well as humanitarian workers. We condemn this unnecessary violence, which will only undermine peace efforts. The need for the nationwide ceasefire to be honored and adhered to by all parties is critical. It is also imperative that the parties commit to the protection of civilians, humanitarian workers, and civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law and relevant UN resolutions, as it is increasingly clear, as repeatedly stated by the Special Envoy, that military options will not end the war. In addition, the A3 underscores the need for decisive collective actions to combat Security Council listed groups such as ISIS, ISIL, and the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in a manner that ensures that victims who have suffered from this menace get justice. Mr. President, moving to the dire humanitarian situation, the A3 notes with concern that it has been compounded significantly by the deteriorating state of the economy. Consequently, more than 4 million Syrians are food insecure, while as many as 5.5 million people require nutrition assistance and have no reliable access to water. The situation has become a driver of other social ills, including early marriages and recruitment into armed groups. The cross-border aid mechanism, complemented by cross-line deliveries, is therefore a vital avenue for humanitarian assistance. It must be sustained even as efforts to expand the cross-line deliveries continue. To ease the colossal humanitarian burden in camps, we call on states to repatriate their citizens, particularly women, children, and the elderly, from camps in Syria, such as the Al-Hol camp, where they have been subjected to severe insecurity and inhumane conditions. The A3 also encourages more support to the early recovery and livelihoods activities under the United Nations humanitarian response. This will greatly help to build resilience and assist Syrians in getting back to normalcy. Mr. President, in concluding, the A3 urges this Council to put aside the multiple competing interests, deal objectively with the Syrian file, and demonstrate that the multilateral system can still be relied on to mediate global peace and security. The A3 countries stand in solidarity with the people of Syria in their quest for peace and reaffirm our respect for Syria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Ghana for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I thank Deputy Special Envoy Najal Roshdi for her briefing, Under Secretary General Griffiths for your briefing, and Mr. Darwish for your insightful remarks. I'd like, in particular, through Deputy Special Envoy Roshdi, to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and his team for your ongoing efforts to facilitate a sustainable resolution to the conflict in Syria through the full implementation of Resolution 2254. This includes a nationwide ceasefire, unhindered aid access, release of the arbitrarily detained, conditions for safe, voluntary and dignified refugee return, and free and fair elections pursuant to a new constitution. You have our full support. As does your call, Martin, for will and action. The UK remains a committed provider of humanitarian aid and early recovery support for the Syrian people. Against this background, it is disappointing that Russia continues to stall the Constitutional Committee process. Geneva is the agreed venue for what should be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned Constitutional Committee talks. It is time to get beyond talking about a location and into the substance. But we agree with Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi that despite obstructions, progress is possible. In that context, we welcome the Secretary-General's recently released report on the missing. Tens of thousands of Syrians have been forcibly disappeared and detained during the conflict, and thousands of families are waiting to hear about loved ones. They deserve answers. We're also pleased to hear of the recent convening of the Women's Advisory Board, an important step in encouraging the meaningful participation and diverse representation of women in the political process. And we welcome the Commission of Inquiry report released today, which highlights the conflict's disproportionate impact on women and girls. As the Commission's report makes clear, the Syrian regime and its allies bear primary responsibility for the devastation in Syria. The data shared by OCHA has made clear the stark humanitarian challenge, aggravated by increased uncertainty for humanitarian providers. We should ensure that the 14.6 million Syrians who need assistance get it in the most efficient and effective way possible and in accordance with international humanitarian law. Despite the efforts on cross-line that Martin set out, there is clearly no substitute for the scope and scale of the cross-border operation mandated by this Council. We look forward to the Council uniting in its commitment to save lives and avoid any disruption to this. Millions of civilians depend on it. Thank you, President. I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. I should like to thank the briefers for their statements. President, recurrent clashes, including artillery fire, are disquieting. Mexico condemns the attacks against Aleppo airport at the beginning of this month, and we are closely following military presence and movements on the northern border. We call for Syria's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity to be upheld. It is clearly urgent to redouble efforts to ensure a national ceasefire. We commend, moreover, the work of the Special Envoy to coordinate the discussions of the Constitutional Committee and regular dialogue with regional stakeholders, the Women's Advisory Board and civil society representatives. We regret the fact that to date it has not been possible to convene the 9th session of the small body of the committee, and especially the fact that the need to change the location for the talks is being posited as an argument for halting its work. It's necessary to work on confidence-building measures, as with the issue of detained and disappeared persons and accountability, whilst the whereabouts of at least 100,000 people is unknown. Mexico notes the recent report of the Secretary-General, and we agree on the importance of making progress towards establishing the facts, identifying remains, and offering full support to victims and families of disappeared and arbitrarily detained persons. Accountability must also be bolstered. Given the impossibility of referring this case to the International Criminal Court, my country reiterates our call for cooperation with the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the Commission of Inquiry, and those investigations ongoing under universal jurisdiction. President, we note the lack of progress in political and chemical weapons tracks in Syria. Progress on the humanitarian front also leaves a lot to be desired. Against a backdrop of food insecurity, which has been exacerbated by the volatility of international prices for fuel and commodities, as well as by adverse climate conditions, such as a lack of water. This situation compels us to make efficient use of all mechanisms available for the distribution of humanitarian assistance. In just over a year, 6 humanitarian convoys have crossed the conflict lines towards the northwest. We hope that the Ras Al Ain mission in the northeast, which was suspended due to the increase of insecurity, will soon resume. Finally, the cross-border mechanism benefits 2.4 million people every month. This attests to the fact that there is no substitute in either scale or scope for this mechanism, and that the cross-line operations are complementary operations. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
السيدة الرئيسة. Madam President, I thank Ms. Najat Rushdi for her first briefing to the Council since assuming her new position. And I also thank Mr. Morton Griffiths for his thorough briefing. We also listened carefully to Mr. Mazen Darwish's intervention. At the outset, we would like to emphasize the need for the Syrian crisis to remain at the forefront of our discussions on urgent issues. Joint efforts must focus on supporting the political track in Syria, bringing international views on this file closer together, and calling for a comprehensive ceasefire throughout Syria. These efforts will help to restore calm and create a conducive environment that encourages Syrians to reach a political solution. We affirm our support for the Special Envoy's efforts to build confidence between the parties. We hope that further steps will be taken in this direction, and we also hope that the Constitutional Committee, which remains an essential component of the political track, will resume its meetings.
Welcome to everyone.
In light of the current
Geneva,
alarming escalation, we reiterate our position against foreign interference in Syria to protect its unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The increase in the number of attacks conducted by terrorist group Daesh in in different areas reflects the continued threat it poses to the security and stability of Syria and the wider region. It also highlights the need for sustained efforts to confront Daesh. Madam President, with the economic situation continues to deteriorate, most Syrians suffer from a lack of basic daily necessities and essential services such as electricity. The difficult conditions in Al-Ahol camp require urgent attention from the international community, especially as Daesh continues to exploit these conditions to spread its extremist ideologies. We note in particular the dire situation of women and girls in the camp. According to UN reports, 75% of murders that have occurred in the camp this year were committed against women, with additional reports of sexual violence. This emphasizes the need to provide protection for women and girls and respond to their special needs. We also highlight the dangers that mines and other unexploded ordinances poses to the Syrian people. 1 out of every 2 people in Syria is at risk of death or injury from an explosive ordinance, which also obstruct humanitarian operations. We therefore need to continue making efforts to properly dispose of unexploded ordinances. We commend the efforts made by relevant agencies, including the UN Mine Section Service, in educating local communities in Syria about their risks. Providing international support for early recovery projects remains essential to improve the living conditions of Syrians. Similarly, it is important to ensure the delivery of unhindered and impartial humanitarian aid to all those in need throughout Syria. We stress the need to create the proper security conditions to enable the humanitarian convoy destined for Ras Al Ain to reach its destination. We're pleased that the Aleppo airport is operating again, as it is essential for facilitating flights of the UN Humanitarian Air Service. We reaffirm our commitment to support efforts to find a political solution to the Syrian crisis and restore security and stability. Thank you.
I thank the representative of UAE and now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
And thank you, Deputy Special Envoy Rushdie and USG Griffiths, for your briefings today. I also wish to thank our civil society briefer, Mazen Darwish, for your valuable perspectives. I will focus on the political situation in my intervention, as my Norwegian colleague has spoken on behalf of Ireland on humanitarian issues. President, Ireland supports the Special Envoy's efforts to de-escalate, both in the north and across Syria. Any military escalation would only add further to the horrors endured by the Syrian people. However, the appalling loss of human life, including of children's lives, continues. In 2021 alone, nearly 900 children lost their lives or were injured. This brings the total number of children killed and injured since 2011 to almost 13,000. Ireland also supports the Special Envoy on restoring momentum to the political process. We renew our calls for the full implementation of Resolution 2254 of this Council. We call on Damascus to engage fully and meaningfully in the Constitutional Committee. Ireland endorses the ongoing engagement with the Women's Advisory Board and with civil society. Any new constitution and related political process must be fully inclusive. It must benefit from the full, equal and meaningful engagement of women. Ireland is open to step-for-step confidence-building measures, provided Damascus engages meaningfully. President, Ireland welcomes the Secretary-General's study on missing people in Syria. We echo his message of appreciation to the victims, their families and civil society for their valuable input. We believe that the proposed mechanism and support to the families of the missing can provide some answers on the fate of their loved ones. Ireland calls on Damascus to be much more transparent on the release of arbitrarily detained people, in particular on the implementation of the amnesty decree announced last April. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank Deputy Special Envoy Rushdie and USG Griffiths for their briefings. I've listened very carefully to the statement delivered by Mr. Darwish. The Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process is the only way to resolve the Syrian issue. China welcomes the sustained efforts of the Special Envoy and his team to promote the political process in Syria. We hope that the parties concerned engage constructively with the UN to properly resolve the differences relating to the small body of the Constitutional Committee, with a view of holding the meeting at an early date and make substantial progress. Special Envoy Peterson put forth the step-for-step approach, which is conducive to creating a favorable condition for the political process. China supports the Special Envoy's continued communication with the parties concerning this. At present, Syria is still facing a complex security situation. The international community should adopt a unified standard on the basis of international law and Security Council resolutions to combat all terrorist forces in Syria with zero tolerance. Actions that condone, harbor, or politically exploit terrorist forces must stop. The sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Syria must be respected. In the absence of the consent of the Syrian government, illegally stationing troops in Syria, or even setting up military bases in Syria, constitute a serious violation of the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Such acts are in no way in line with defending and acting strictly in accordance with the UN Charter. Security Council Resolution 2642 was adopted more than 2 months ago. Since then, only one cross-line delivery has been completed in northwestern Syria, with no improvement in terms of efficiency and scale. I would like to reiterate that cross-border relief modality is only a temporary arrangement made under exceptional circumstances. The transition to cross-line relief operation needs to be accelerated. A clear timetable should be set for the eventual termination of cross-border delivery. The permanent representative of Syria twice sent letters to the President of the Council on the 2nd and 7th of September, respectively, condemning the attacks on the airports of Damascus and Aleppo. These airports are important cross-line transfer hubs of humanitarian supplies. Attacks on humanitarian infrastructure must cease immediately. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. I join others in thanking Ms. Rushdie for her briefing and wish her all success for her new assignment. We also thank USG Martin Griffiths and Mr. Darwish for their updates on the humanitarian situation. Madam President, it is our view that the stalemate in the political process has become unsustainable. The small body of the Constitutional Committee has not met since last May, and as evident from today's briefing, uncertainty over the next round continues. While the Special Envoy's efforts in engaging with all stakeholders are commendable, any positive impact on the political track is yet to be seen. The reasons are obvious. External factors are impeding the political process in Syria. The stakeholders have not shown any indication of flexibility or compromise. We hope that all sides will engage constructively and purposefully with the Special Envoy in his pursuit to facilitate the political process in line with Resolution 2254. We continue to believe that his efforts need to be supported by the Council, in particular the step-by-step approach. Madam President, we hope that regional players will continue to play an important role supplementing the efforts of the Special Envoy. In this context, continuing normalization of Syria's relations with its Arab neighbors is a reassuring development. At the same time, we are concerned over acts of external players compromising Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This cannot be conducive for the political process. On the security front, we remain concerned with the overall situation in Syria. There is an urgent need for serious attempts towards a comprehensive nationwide ceasefire in Syria. We believe that withdrawal of all foreign forces is essential toward realizing this objective. India has been consistently cautioning against the looming threat posed by the resurgence of terrorist groups in Syria. UN-designated terrorist groups continue to gain in strength in the country. The global fight against terrorism cannot and should not be compromised for narrow political gains. The credibility of the international community's collective fight against terrorism can be strengthened only by ensuring accountability of terrorists and terrorist groups. India continues to call for enhanced and effective humanitarian assistance to all Syrians. throughout the country without discrimination, politicization and preconditions. While cross-border operations are predictable and important, they cannot be operating in perpetuity. Concrete steps need to be taken to address the hurdles that are obstructing the functioning of cross-line operations. India believes that humanitarian assistance cannot be a matter of political expediency. Linking humanitarian and developmental assistance with the progress in the political process will only exacerbate the humanitarian sufferings. Syria is undergoing an acute fuel and power shortage. The international community also needs to look constructively at promoting projects which will bring much-needed jobs and economic opportunities for the Syrian people. In conclusion, Madam President, let me underline India's sustained commitment to extending developmental assistance and human resource development support to Syria. Our continued support to the people of Syria in their endeavor for seeking lasting peace and stability will remain steadfast and unwavering. Thank you.
I thank the representative of India for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the briefers for their presentations. Special Envoy Pedersen told us last month that we needed to be honest about the mismatch between the scale of our collective political efforts and the scale of the challenge at hand. We agree. Troubling signs of military escalation are appearing, with additional civil casualties and the destruction of essential civilian infrastructure. We once again call on all parties to comply with international humanitarian law, including the prohibition on indiscriminate attacks and the obligation to take all feasible precautions to avoid harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure. In relation to the political process established by Resolution 2254, we regret the lack of progress since the postponement of the 9th session of the small body of the Constitutional Committee. We thank Mr. Pedersen and Ms. Rushdie for their efforts to resolve the issues that are preventing the planned meetings to happen, and hope the committee will soon be able to reconvene, possibly with fresh ideas and renewed political will. On a positive note, we welcome the recent meeting of the Syrian Women's Advisory Board. Madam President, Brazil supports the implementation of Resolution 2642 in all its aspects. Humanitarian assistance must continue to reach all those in need via all modalities, cross-border, cross-line, and with the indispensable support of early recovery projects. It is worrisome that overall funding to Syria's humanitarian response plan currently stands at only around 25% of the requested funds. The progress on early recovery must continue, and we recognize the commitment of the United Nations in this regard. The fact that violence impedes the ability of the United Nations to operate is a serious concern. Brazil reminds all parties of their obligation to facilitate rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access to civilians in need across Syria. We also recall that the humanitarian effects of sanctions must not be overlooked. WFP's early warning report on hunger hotspots not only portrays a very difficult scenario for Syria, but also states that sanctions can be blamed. Brazil reiterates the importance of conducting a thorough assessment of the potential deleterious consequences of unilateral sanctions on the civilian populations. Madam President, soon we will have the first round of the informal interactive dialogue foreseen by Resolution 2642. We look forward to a frank and non-politicized discussion. Brazil deems very important the strengthening of principled and technically informed dialogue on humanitarian issues.
In times of heightened geopolitical tensions and overlapping systemic crises, the risk of humanitarian operations becoming part of a political give and take is very concrete and maybe even inevitable. To mitigate this trend, diplomacy and principles must be given an opportunity. While we know that predictable cross-border operations are indispensable at the moment, they cannot continue to exist in perpetuity. Concrete steps need to be taken to address the hurdles that are obstructing the functioning of cross-line operations. We see the interactive dialogue as an opportunity to have more detailed information about the concerns of all parties in relation to humanitarian operations in Syria. In conclusion, Brazil once more thanks Special Envoy for his attempts to engage with all sides and facilitate the political process in line with Resolution 2254, and to propose confidence-building measures. Brazil's position remains unchanged. Only a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led United Nations facilitated political process with due regard to the preservation of Syria's territorial integrity and sovereignty can offer a lasting solution to the conflict. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Madam President, we would like to thank the Deputy Special Envoy, Ms. Najat Roshdi, and the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths. We thank them for their briefings on the political and humanitarian situation in Syria. We see no alternative to moving forward the political settlement process in Syria, the process which is led and owned by the Syrians themselves with the UN assistance and strictly in line with the Security Council Resolution 2254. This understanding of ours was reaffirmed in the course of a meeting between the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Mr. Vershinin, with the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, Mr. Pedersen, on the 7th of September in Geneva. In this context, we are convinced it's important to resume the work of the Constitutional Committee. It's the best format for a direct intra-Syrian dialogue without linking it to a specific location. We, in turn, will continue further facilitating steady work of the Constitutional Committee to make sure that the Syrians themselves, without interference from the outside, could come to an agreement on all outstanding issues as regards the future of their country. And together with our partners in the Astana format, Iran and Turkey, we are going to continue facilitating long-term normalization in Syria. Against this background, the situation on the ground continues tense. There is still the threat of yet another military operation in the north of the country. There is an increased number of random attacks by Israeli Air Force, and that there is a continued illegal foreign military presence by the United States and allies in Trans-Euphrates and at Tanfa, and this escalates an already explosive situation. We particularly regret the fact that the international community, including the leadership of the UN, basically ignores the many appeals by Damascus having to do with the violations of UN Charter, international humanitarian law, in particular related to the American occupation of regions of Syria and the American looting of Syrian natural resources. According to the Ministry of Oil and Natural Resources of Syria, the losses in the energy sector since 2011 as a result of actions by the United States and the Kurds administration are in the area of $107 billion. The Western states, first and foremost the United States, in the current situation need to review their approaches and reject their flawed intent to isolate Syria internationally. In particular, they need to stop impeding the process of its return into the Arab family. A swift normalization of the relationship between Damascus and in the region, dialogue and interaction with the Syrian leadership is in the interest of long-term settlement within the Syrian Arab Republic and general stabilization in the region. Practically, also, this would help enhance the effectiveness of collective efforts to combat terrorism and, as a consequence, will strengthen regional security. It would also help incentivize the process of Syrian refugees' return. Madam President, We regret the fact that in order to entrench the territorial fracture of the country and undermine the sovereignty of Damascus, purely humanitarian instruments are being used as well. Let me give an example. It is what was created in 2014 as a special and temporary measure, the cross-border mechanism for humanitarian supplies, circumventing the government of Syria and in violation of the guidelines of humanitarian assistance we have in Resolution 46-182 of the General Assembly. Under the guise of supposed concern for 4 million needy in Idlib, the needs of other people in Syria are being ignored, most of whom live on government-controlled territories. And they are denied by the Western countries in urgent assistance, and Western countries are also politicize the early recovery of critical civilian infrastructure, which is on the brink of collapse. At the same time, the United States and allies are suffocating them with illegal unilateral sanctions, and at the same time, they demonstrate latitude for those regions which are not controlled by Damascus. What is also revealing here is the desire to hold on the Syrians and their host countries, and also the Al-Hol and Raqqa camps, which are infamous for their terrible humanitarian situation. The security situation in Al-Hol is beyond the pale. The premeditated murders have become a routine occurrence there. We underscore the fact that all responsibility of what happens beyond Euphrates and in the At-Tanf area, artificially created by Washington, flooded with fighters of all kinds, belongs fully with the United States. Mr. President, we consider Resolution 2462 by the Security Council not only as a compromise, but also as a vital measure to depoliticize and broaden humanitarian assistance to Syria. This includes sustained cross-line access to all countries from Damascus and the early recovery of water and electricity supply, medical and education facilities, and housing stock. We attach great importance to what we have for the first time in the resolution, namely an opportunity for a candid exchange in New York on specific modalities of humanitarian activity within the framework of the informal interactive dialogue. We expect to have its constructive discussion planned to take its constructive discussion during the first round planned to take place this month. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I briefly give the floor back to Norway.
Thank you so much, President. I'll just now make a statement in my national capacity on the political situation in Syria. And I once again thank the Deputy Special Envoy and also Mr. Darwish for your remarks. The issue of missing and arbitrarily detained persons in Syria is of utmost importance, and Norway welcomes the Secretary General's report to the General Assembly on missing persons in Syria. Progress on this issue is essential for the wider political process and eventually reconciliation in Syria. This is why we welcome the Syrian authorities' amnesty that was announced in April. However, we regret that there has been little progress in implementing it. We will continue to urge Syrian authorities to step up their efforts to implement the amnesty and to share more information. President, we are disappointed by the continued lack of progress on the political track, including the stalled process in the Constitutional Committee. Norway gives our full support to the work of the Special Envoy to implement all aspects of Resolution 2254. We will continue
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.